Welcome to Out with Dan, the podcast that spotlights and examines the voices of LGBTQ+ authors, characters, and our allies. Together, we lift our voices and we tell our stories. I'm Dan White. Join me as I chat with this week's author. Hello and welcome back to Out with Dan. Today I'm excited to talk to Eryk Pruitt about Blood Red Summer. Welcome, Eryk.
Hey, thank you very much, Dan. Thanks for having me, man.
Oh, I'm so excited. This book was delicious, which is a favorite word of mine. It's hard to call a murder mystery delicious, but it is delicious. You've done such a magnificent job with this. Can you give the audience a brief overview of what the book is about?
Yes, the book follows Jess Keeler, who has been a true crime podcaster, and she was the star of the previous book called Something Bad Wrong. And now she's teamed up with a true crime documentary crew that is a little bit unscrupulous, and they start to try to uncover one case, which leads them into another cold case, and all craziness abounds.
I love it. I love it. You know, and it's important for anyone who heard you say that Jess was in the previous book. Blood Red Summer stands on its own completely. You don't have to have read the one before, which is always, I like reading books in series, but it's always nice to know that I don't have to, because everybody is fully formed here.
Thank you very much. I was really hoping that that's how it would play.
And it really does, Eryk. So it's dual timelines, current period and 1984. And I'll share with the audience, because I'm not ashamed that I'm 61. But in 1984, I was 21. And there's a lot of residual racism left over from where we have been in this country and where we still are fighting for a lot of stuff. So tell us about how, I don't want to say fun, but how interesting was it for you to delve between the two races and in the two time periods?
Well, yeah, you're right. The original crimes that they're investigating take place in 1984. And so therefore we get the perspective of some people from 1984 that kind of fill in the pieces that our present day investigators don't have. And two of those pieces are a faded newspaper reporter and a man who is a black deputy in 1984, who we come to find out is going to be the first black sheriff of the county, a decade later. I found it when I was researching. I like to research using a lot of old newspapers, from the time period. So that's where I was finding out some of the little fun tidbits, like the only successful escape from an American death row happened right here in the area at the time period of my story in 1984. It was the Briley brothers, and that's a for real deal story. And so when I was trying to figure out what people would be talking about, the little water cooler conversations they'd be having, that would definitely be it. Briley brothers would be on the tip of everybody's tongue at that time period. Also, I found it interesting that, it's 1984, which is 20 years after the Civil Rights Act passed. I'm a child at this time, and it's not really that long ago from now. I guess it is, but still, they were still identifying people in the newspapers as, if they were talking about somebody had been picked up, so-and-so got picked up for bootlegging, so-and-so 34 years old picked up from bootlegging. And then later they would say so-and-so 29 years old Negro picked up for bootlegging. So they were still separating people from just the default to Negro. And I just found that so odd. This case that we cover in Blood Red Summer is based on a real life case. There was a sniper in Durham that terrorized the black part of town in 1976. And just a quick background, I did my own true crime podcast. It's an 8-part series that followed a missing couple that went missing in 71 and turned up dead, and it would never been solved. So I worked with the Orange County Sheriff's Office on that. We did an 8-episode thing. It's called The Long Dance. And after we did The Long Dance, everyone was asking me, what would we do next for a podcast? And the story that just absolutely blew my mind was this Durham sniper, because nobody ever talked about it. And nobody ever talked about it because it happened in a black part of town. And they had 4 victims, 4 people just gunned down randomly in the black part of town. The only place you ever hear anything about this in the newspapers is the obituaries that their families paid for. It doesn't say gunned down, it just said died. You know, then a white newspaper editor is killed on the outside of just outside the little black part of town, which they call South Side. And the next day, it's like the newspapers had 9/11 font. You know, it's like sniper attacking Durham, and like they never cared when the black folk were getting killed, and it's just crazy that could happen. You know, you put that in a book, and people are like, oh, it would never. It happened. You know, it happened. This sniper preyed on people for weeks, and nobody cared until he hit a white guy. Now they eventually ended up catching somebody for it, but the person they caught for it was caught with a revolver, not a sniper rifle. He's a black kid. He was he was touched, had some mental issues, and they just said, we got him, and threw him in jail and said, that's it. And so that's always just kind of come off as fishy. I would have wanted to have done a story on that, but, you know, back to speaking about, you know, the problems with race, I don't think, you know, the family members who lived through that and were traumatized by that would have been too excited by, you know, a white guy coming in 40 years later when nobody gave a shit 40 years ago. No white people gave a shit 40 years ago. And here comes this white guy promising entertainment, you know, to the masses on their story 40 years out of nowhere. And I never could gear myself up to knock on that door or make that call or send that email, along with other problems we had with going forward with it. And so here we are.
Well, and it's totally understandable, Eryk. I mean, I think one word you mentioned was entertainment. To families of victims, it's never entertainment for them. I've always been surprised about how many people love to see things about John Gotti, but what we never see are the people whose lives were affected horrifically by the Gotti crime family. I mean, it's an interesting read, yes, but it's hard to ask the families of victims because they're still a victim, especially when I know, having grown up in Eastern North Carolina, it was so easy to rush to judgment against a person of color than it was for someone else. You know, those things as soon as a black person was arrested, that made all the news because the heroes had captured the villain. But you never ever saw where someone was arrested and then they said, whoopsie, we got the wrong person.
Yeah, exactly. And like, you know, we're calling it entertainment, and that's kind of what it is, because when people are wanting to talk about, when the socialites or whatever wanting to talk about crime, what they think is crime is like, the staircase or O.J. Simpson. And they think, or an angry husband who's killed his wife because he's got a mistress on the side, or one of those little the Murdaugh stories down there in South Carolina. They think that's what crime is. When like what crime is something completely different. I try to cover that, and it's got its causes. It's got, and I try to cover that in Blood Red Summer, where like there's 2 major sensational cases: the sniper, which nobody wants to talk about because it takes part in the black part of town, and then this massacre that happens against bikers because those poor white trash, right. Biker club. The trash taking out the trash is what one of the characters called it. Absolutely. And even when I was pitching the second podcast, that's what people were saying. They're like, nobody really wants to hear about criminals killing other criminals. And I was like, well, those random, black people that were walking weren't criminals. They were going to their job. They weren't criminals. So it's funny that A, they would loop that into criminals, and then B, they didn't even care about the white crimes because that's bad guys and bad guys. So that's what crime. Why are these people forced to act this way? Why are they forced to stick up the liquor store? Why do they do these things? That's what crime is, not the staircase, not O.J. Simpson.
Absolutely. So I guess maybe your main protagonist, or maybe you have 2. So Jess Keeler is obviously one of them. Would you call Hal Broadstreet another protagonist in your book?
Yeah, absolutely. Although I'm sure everybody he runs into would consider him the antagonist. Yeah, I guess if you looked at the book as 2 different things, 1984 and present day, absolutely. Hal's running the show in 1984.
So I love Hal. I feel like Hal is really and honestly the everyman in today's society. Hal's out there trying to make a little difference. Hal is on the wrong side of corporate downsiding, and yet he refuses to give up. And he fights for his friends, people he honestly knows are his friends, and they're not the mayor or the most upstanding person in town, but what Hal fights for is humanity. And that's something I thought you wove into the story so wonderfully, in the fact that Hal's character, people mean things to Hal.
Yeah, a lot of people want a story, and Hal sees beyond the story. You know, he sees that these are people, and he's trying to get these people's stories told, as opposed to like the more popular newspapers or the newspapers that are coming up and have better backing. They're like basically repeating press releases. And this is a moment that I found too that was very true in 1984 with journalism. You know, I grew up in Dallas, and I used to deliver paper for the Dallas Times Herald. And it was the Dallas Times Herald and the Dallas Morning News. And the Times Herald went out. You know, the Morning News survived. Even here in Durham, between the Herald and the Sun, you know, it was the same thing. So a lot of towns had two newspapers. A lot of big cities, they had a morning paper and an evening paper. And about the time in 1984, that's when you start to get kind of, you know, cable news is starting to take off. You find that more people are buying the Inquirer or tabloids.
Yes. Yep.
And so a lot of newspapers were like, all right, that's what people are going to buy, is this sensational stuff. And Hal still believes in the old journalism where, you know, you get out and you tell the story, and people are like, no, you know, shrinking his word count. And they're telling you, you got to sell, you know, splashier things, more sensational things. And that's what Hal is trying to do to keep his paper afloat, so he can tell the stories he believes in. Cops hate him though, because he's not, you know, the cops are giving all the good quotes to the other paper, which if you read something bad wrong, you know, one of the reporters she works for the other paper, and she makes a return appearance. But cops are giving the quotes to the other paper, and to Hal, they're just kind of knocking them around some.
Well, and so you mentioned Olivia, who's the other reporter. And one of the things I liked about Olivia is you also, because Olivia is a woman and she's coming up in a time where women reporters weren't popular, they were sort of almost laughed at because they couldn't handle the big stories. But I think what you do with Olivia is fun in the fact that you give her some humanity. She has her own battles to fight because she is a female and she's trying to get ahead in life. But then Olivia gives us some surprises at the end that I didn't see coming. I will say that's another big thing. There were a couple of what I would call character shifts that I did not see coming. And I was like, look at Eryk being all this talent and stuff. So that was, but there was no
Thank you so much, Dan.
Oh, you're welcome. But a big thing though is, because this is on my podcast, a lot of people will hear me say the same thing. You gave us something new, but you didn't lie to me, which is very important, because if you had purposefully deceived me, red herrings I love, but don't deceive me. And you did not. You just you sort of picked up the edge of the carpet and we saw some of the dirt under the carpet, and I loved it.
Thank you very much. I have my mother to blame for that. My dearly departed mother. She told me once, she was like, I will trust you forever until you lie to me once. You lie to me once, and I'll never trust you again.
That's very true. So did you have one character that you really, really liked more than the others, or did you have one that you hated more than the others?
In this one, I liked following Ennis Worthy around, that deputy. I have a vision for where he starts and where he ends up, which is kind of fun. But you already see where he ends up. But I like taking people on his journey and showing him, you know, what he's about. And of course, it's always fun. Just I had too much fun, I think, with Hal Broadstreet. There's a lot that was actually cut out because I was just trying everything, and the editors were like, "I think we're getting it." It was just I could sit down for dinner with him and just describe how he eats. It's that easy.
Absolutely, and I absolutely loved him because I also understood where he was in his life as well. You know, being a person of color and then trying to work his way up, and he eventually does work his way up, but it's not easy. You know, the scene where they Hal meets Lauren for lunch. And the reception Lauren gets by going into a black restaurant. I was like, I totally understand this, because where I grew up, you only ate in the restaurant of people that looked like you. It's a sad thing, but it's just the way it was when I was growing up.
Oh, I put the little moment in there as something from real life. I went to meet a friend of mine who is of color once in a restaurant that, like, you know, back then white people just didn't go to. Food was good, but like you just didn't go. But I didn't care. He's a friend of mine, so I went and met him, and I sat down, and they brought him his food on a plate, and they brought mine to go. And I was like, man, I was gonna sit here and eat, and they're like, yeah, you think so?
Oh
like,
my God!
I was like, all right, I'll see y'all later. But yeah, that was, you know, we're you know, I know this is the week of Juneteenth, and I remember growing up in Texas, you know, that's where that started, and nobody in the rest of the country had ever heard of it before. But that was always the thing to me, was to make sure that, like, you get invited to somebody's Juneteenth party, because those were always the biggest parties. And
the most
I was
fun.
usually the only white face at a Juneteenth party, but I know how to sniff out a party, man. That's where I learned to play dominoes.
That's right. I'm like, let's make it count. Why not go have fun and enjoy? And I mean, I do think that there's so many wonderful humans in this world. There's a lot of trash as well, but I think I think you gave us both the underbelly and the reality of life in small town America. And this time it's in Virginia, so we can always blame them because it's across the border.
We always do. They say it's for lovers, but come on.
Please. Ain't nobody going to Virginia to be a lover unless there's money involved. Oh, Eryk, this has been so fun. Again, the book is called Blood Red Summer. Eryk, do you have a website or a social media you would like to share?
I certainly do. My website is erykpruitt.com, and it's spelled ERYK, PRUITT. And that's my Instagram and Facebook, you know, and that's pretty much where you'll find me.
Fantastic. And thank you for joining me for this week's episode of Out with Dan. You can find more information about this podcast and its host at OutWithDan.com, on Twitter at OutWithDan, and on Instagram and Facebook at GoOutWithDan. This podcast is hosted by Authors on the Air Global Radio Network, and the theme music is provided by bensound.com. Join us again soon for the next episode of Out with Dan.